My sentence is that Russian officials have been pretty clear that their threshold, at least for using nuclear weapons, is the survival of the Russian state and government. And I'm not sure how losing the war in Ukraine would actually mean the end of the Russian state or government. Now, people can come up with logic trains about how this may
Sure.
deteriorate domestic political consensus around Putin. I'm not entirely convinced, but one thing to say is when Putin annexed Donetsk and Lugansk, there were people who said what Putin has now done is he has made these Russian territory. They're now part of the Russian Federation. Attacks by Ukraine in these areas will be considered to be attacks on Russia's sovereign territory,
Hmm.
and we will see potentially nuclear weapons use. And we haven't seen that. The conflict continues. Ukraine appears to actually be taking territory back in this area. So I think that Russia is dealing with an interesting situation, and that is not only do tactical nuclear weapons not have a lot of military utility to Russia, but the reason that Russia is in part able to do what it is doing is because of support from other countries. And one of the things is everyone looks at the voting that happened in the UN General Assembly on condemning Russia's invasion. And what's not really well known to a lot of people is the countries that voted with Russia or abstained from voting with Russia, even though there it's like 40 something countries, something like that, and the great majority of countries in the world voted essentially to condemn Russia. Countries that abstained or voted with Russia actually represent 52% of the world's population.
Right.
So the governments, right, which are either abstaining or voting with Russia, are the majority of the world's population. And the two key players here, right, are China and India. And China and India both are also nuclear armed states. And they continue to trade with Russia. And it's important to think about the nuclear doctrine of China and India. And China and India both have a no first use of nuclear weapons doctrine.
Mm.
And so their belief is that the use of nuclear weapons first in a conflict cannot be done. And it is my understanding, as reported by the news media, that China and India have been very clear with Russia that were you to use nuclear weapons, that would cross a red line with China and also create chaos with India as well too. And then if you start thinking about Russia's now increased economic dependence on China for consumer goods, other products, machinery, China as an export market for Russia, as well as essentially a large market for energy, given the situation in Europe, I think that there are real consequences. So I'm not convinced that, being unable to fight the conflict in Ukraine anymore is going to be enough to prompt the use of nuclear weapons. What I think we're going to get is I think we're going to get a long-term hurting stalemate, four,
Right.
5, 6 years. And people forget, right? The war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014. This isn't a new thing. What is scary, though, is stalemates generally don't make either side happy. And we've seen that in the past year, more than that, between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Long-term stalemate, right? So stalemates are volatile, dangerous, other things. But again, scenarios for the actual use of nuclear weapons by Russia and Ukraine, I just don't see very many scenarios for them to be used. And
Oh,
so, yeah, go ahead, please.
then let me paraphrase the question. So you assign a very, very low probability to the use of tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons in general in Ukraine. So what would you need to see to change your mind? What events? What kind of, what would you say like, oh wow, now I need to kind of ring the alarm bell. Something has changed, and bets are off.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I would say is when I assign a low probability to the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I would say it is a non-zero probability, though, and that is very important. I interact with a lot of experts from a lot of different countries who have backgrounds in foreign ministries, defense ministries, militaries, and I ask the same question. And we talk about like what are percentages. And I've heard people give percentages all the way up to 20% and as low as less than 1%. And if you think about, right, the statistical range of all the way up to 20% and less than 1%, like a fraction of a percent, that's enormous. And it just shows the general lack of consensus. And it shows that anyone who tries to peg you with a very specific number is probably speculating, as we all are, because, of course, only Putin knows what the true threshold will be. And so it is interesting, though, because let's consider the case of the Cold War going back. And so we got through the Cold War without the use of nuclear weapons. And many will say this is because of nuclear deterrence. It's a stabilizing factor. It created stability between the sides. We didn't see the use of nuclear weapons because of mutually assured destruction. And I think that there's certainly a lot of truth to that as far as nuclear weapons being a stabilizing factor. But imagine if we were to, I don't know, do a mathematical simulation, right? We're going to go back and we're going to simulate the Cold War 5 times, 10 times, 100 times, 10,000 times. How many times do we actually, right, get out of the Cold War without the use of nuclear weapons? My guess is the majority of the time we do get out of the Cold War without the use of nuclear weapons. But I think there will certainly be times where we actually see catastrophe and essentially, near apocalyptic type scenarios. And so I think that's something to think about as far as speculating in odds. When someone says, I put it at less than 1%, that's still a non-zero probability. And so the risk of using nuclear weapons, right, existed before February 2022, but I think it's elevated, even though it remains low. And so your direct question about what would I need to see to change my mind about the potential use of nuclear weapons? And that is, as I would say, the devil is in the data. And right now, in addition to intelligence agencies in the world, which obviously do this and have, classified systems of national technical means to share with the public, we've seen a great rise in open source intelligence around the world. And we know that analysts can sit all over the world at their desk looking at INSAR data and other things, and they can make determinations about things that they can see that previously only intelligence agencies of the world had access to. And it's also really beneficial, too, for national governments who don't want to reveal their sources and methods, because the US government, the Russian government, Chinese government, NATO countries reveal their satellite imagery, right? You can probably back out some of the capabilities that they have. And so, some of these companies, right, are imaging the full planet every day with satellite imagery. And so when I say the devil's in the data, is, Russian tactical nuclear weapons are kept in central storage facilities. In order to get them out, you need to take specific procedures. There need to be specific movements to increase their operational readiness. We haven't seen anything resembling that of increased Russian operational readiness for the use of nuclear weapons. And so I'll start being scared when 2 things happen. The first is rhetorical, right? And that is, if Vladimir Putin starts saying, as my Russian colleagues say, if you do this, I will use nuclear weapons, then I feel like that's elevated compared to just saying the scary details out loud. And the second thing is if I start to see movements or start hearing about actual movements of nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities, then I think that I will be increasingly concerned.